A poor black girl in a yellow raincoat was seen following a confused elderly woman. When the woman's family discovered what really happened that rainy evening, they couldn't hold back their tears. The rain hit Sarah Johnson's yellow raincoat in heavy drops as she walked down Morrison Street. Her sneakers splashed through puddles, already soaked through. She pulled the worn coat tighter, the plastic material crackling against her school uniform. The afternoon traffic crawled by, windshield wipers working overtime. Just 3 more blocks, she muttered, checking her watch. 5:15 p.m. Her little sister would be waiting. That morning had started like any other. Sarah stood in their small kitchen, making peanut butter sandwiches while her mother rushed around getting ready for work. "Baby, don't forget Lily needs her inhaler," her mother called out, pulling on her worn work shoes. "It's in the front pocket of her backpack." "Got it, Mom?" Sarah carefully wrapped the sandwiches in plastic wrap. "I put an extra one in there for Mrs. Martinez's kid, too." Her mother paused, hand on the doorknob. "Sarah, honey, we barely have enough. Mom, Tommy's mom is sick again. He didn't eat yesterday." Sarah met her mother's tired eyes. "We can share." Her mother's face softened. She crossed the kitchen and pulled Sarah into a tight hug, the smell of drugstore perfume mixing with fabric softener. "You've got such a big heart, baby. Just like your grandma May." She pulled back, hands on Sarah's shoulders. "But you're 11. You shouldn't have to worry about all this." "I'm okay, Mom." "Really?" Sarah managed a smile. "Go on, you'll be late." Now, hours later, Sarah stopped at the corner store. She needed to grab milk before heading home. The bell chimed as she pushed open the door, water dripping from her coat onto the linoleum floor. Mr. Chin looked up from his newspaper. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Can I help you?" Sarah felt her shoulders tense. She'd been in here 100 times, but he always watched her like she might steal something. "Just getting milk, Mr. Chun." She walked to the cooler, feeling his eyes follow her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She grabbed a half-gallon of whole milk, the cheapest brand. As she approached the counter, an elderly white woman in a pink sweater entered the store. Mr. Chen's face immediately brightened. "Mrs. Wilson, how are you today?" Sarah placed the milk on the counter, pulling out wadded dollar bills from her coat pocket. Mr. Chen took his time, chatting with Mrs. Wilson about the weather, before finally turning to ring up Sarah's purchase. "That'll be $3.49. Sarah counted out the money carefully. 3 crumpled ones and 2 quarters, saved from her lunch money. Mr. Chun took it without meeting her eyes, dropping the coins into the register with a clang. Outside again, Sarah clutched the milk close to her chest. The rain had gotten heavier. Thunder rumbled in the distance. She quickened her pace, passing the Methodist church with its rain-slick steps. That's when she heard it, a confused voice, trembling with age and fear. "Eleanor? Eleanor, is that you?" Sarah turned. An elderly woman stood in the rain, wearing a pink housecoat and slippers. Her white hair was plastered to her head, and she clutched a plastic shopping bag. She peered at passing cars with frightened eyes. "Eleanor, dear, when did they change all the streets around?" Sarah stopped walking. The woman was clearly confused. "Lost." A group of teenage boys passed by, snickering. "Yo, Granny's out for a wet walk. Someone forgot to take their meds." The woman flinched at their laughter, clutching her bag tighter. She took an unsteady step forward, her slippers splashing in a puddle. Sarah looked at her watch again. 5:25 p.m. Lily would be worried. She should keep walking. This wasn't her problem, but her feet wouldn't move. She thought of her grandmother May, who died before Sarah was born. What if she had been lost and confused like this, and everyone just walked by? "Ma'am?" Sarah called out softly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman turned, blinking rain from her eyes. "Eleanor? Is that you, dear?" Sarah stepped closer, holding her umbrella over the woman's head. "I'm not Eleanor, ma'am. My name is Sarah. You look like you might be lost." Up close, Sarah could see the woman was shivering. Her housecoat was soaked through, and her slippers were falling apart in the rain. "Lost?" The woman looked around, confusion clouding her face. No, I'm just going to the grocery store. Mr. Patterson's store on Cedar Street." But everything looked so different. Sarah's stomach tightened. Mr. Patterson's store had closed years ago. Her mother had told her about it. What's your name, ma'am? I'm, I'm Mrs. Peterson. Martha Peterson. She gripped Sarah's arm suddenly. Eleanor, why aren't you at school? Your mother will be so worried. Sarah swallowed hard. The woman clearly had some form of dementia or Alzheimer's. She glanced at her watch again. 5:30 p.m. A car drove by, splashing water onto the sidewalk. Mrs. Peterson jumped, pressing closer to Sarah. It's getting dark, she whispered. I need to get home before dark. Sarah took a deep breath. The milk was getting warm against her chest. Lily would be scared, alone in the apartment. But she couldn't leave this confused woman in the rain. Mrs. Peterson, let me help you get home. Do you remember your address? The woman's face brightened. Oh yes, 1247 Maple Street. The blue house with the rose bushes. Then her face fell. But the roses aren't blooming right now. Eleanor, why aren't the roses blooming? Sarah shifted the milk to her other arm. It's okay, Mrs. Peterson. Let's see if we can find Maple Street together. Thunder cracked overhead, making them both jump. Mrs. Peterson clutched Sarah's arm tighter. Eleanor, I'm scared. Don't be scared, Mrs. Peterson. I've got you. Sarah adjusted the umbrella to better cover them both. We'll find your home. As they started walking, Sarah pulled out her phone with her free hand. One missed call from Lily. Her finger hovered over the callback button, but Mrs. Peterson stumbled, nearly falling. Sarah quickly steadied her, putting her phone away. The call would have to wait. Right now, this confused, frightened woman needed her help. They took their first steps together into the rain, Sarah's yellow raincoat a bright spot in the gathering gloom. Behind them, more thunder rumbled, and the rain continued to fall. The street signs were hard to read through the rain. Sarah squinted at each corner they passed, trying to keep track of their location while supporting Mrs. Peterson's unsteady steps. The plastic shopping bag swung from the elderly woman's hand, hitting Sarah's leg with each step. Eleanor, dear, Mrs. Peterson said, patting Sarah's arm. Your hair is different today. Did your mother finally let you braid it? Sarah touched one of her own braids, water dripping from the ends. Mrs. Peterson, I'm not. You always wanted braids like the other girls at school. Mrs. Peterson's voice drifted off, lost in memory. Your mother was so strict about keeping your hair, just so. A car horn blared nearby, making Mrs. Peterson jump. Her fingers dug into Sarah's arm. It's okay, Sarah soothed, though her own heart was racing. Just a car. She checked her phone again. 5:45 p.m. 3 missed calls from Lily now. They turned onto Oak Street, passing houses with warm lights glowing in windows. Sarah's wet sneakers squeaked against the sidewalk. The milk jug was getting heavy, but she didn't dare set it down. Mrs. Peterson, are you sure about the address? 1247 Maple Street? The elderly woman's face crumpled in confusion. Maple Street? No, we live on Cedar. Next to the Patterson boy who broke my window with his baseball last summer. She stopped walking suddenly. Or was that a long time ago? Sarah's stomach twisted. They were getting nowhere. She needed to call someone, but who? Her mother would be working until 9, and she couldn't leave Lily alone much longer. Her phone buzzed again. Lily calling. Sarah answered while keeping the umbrella steady over Mrs. Peterson. Lily, hey. Sarah, where are you? Her sister's voice was high with worry. Mom called, and I didn't know what to say. Listen, I'm okay. I'm helping someone who's lost. Can you tell Mom I'll be home soon? But Sarah, please, Lily. I promise I'll explain everything later. Just do your homework and lock the door. I'll bring milk. Mrs. Peterson tugged on Sarah's sleeve. Eleanor, who are you talking to? You know your father doesn't like you using the telephone after dinner. A group of people hurried past them, huddled under umbrellas, giving them odd looks. Sarah felt her face grow hot. I have to go, Lily. Love you. She hung up, turning back to Mrs. Peterson. Let's try walking a little further. Maybe you'll recognize something. They passed a playground, its swings moving ghost-like in the wind. Mrs. Peterson stopped again, staring. Look, Eleanor, that's where you broke your arm in 4th grade. Remember? You were trying to jump from the swing like Tommy dared you to. Sarah glanced at the empty playground, rain pelting the metal equipment. Mrs. Peterson, what color is your house? Maybe that would help us find it. Blue, Mrs. Peterson said firmly. Then uncertainty crossed her face. No, yellow? Eleanor, Why can't I remember? A police car cruised slowly past them. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat, but it didn't stop. She watched its taillights disappear into the rain. You know, Mrs. Peterson said suddenly, her voice clearer, you look just like my granddaughter Eleanor when she was your age. She reached out and touched Sarah's cheek with a cold, wet hand. She loved the rain too, always splashing in puddles. What happened to Eleanor? Sarah asked softly. Mrs. Peterson's hand dropped. Her eyes went distant. The accident. 2 years ago. Or was it longer? She clutched her plastic bag tighter. Sometimes I think I see her, but that's silly, isn't it? Eleanor's gone. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. I'm sorry about Eleanor, Mrs. Peterson, but I want to help you get home. Can you try to remember anything else about your house? They stood in the rain for a moment, water dripping from Sarah's umbrella. Mrs. Peterson's face scrunched up in concentration. There's a big oak tree in the front yard, and wind chimes. My Henry hung them for our 40th anniversary. Her eyes cleared slightly. Yes, wind chimes. Silver ones that sound like church bells. Okay, good. That's really helpful. Sarah tried to sound encouraging. Which direction should we try? Mrs. Peterson pointed vaguely toward the east. That way, I think. Everything looks so strange in the rain. They started walking again. Sarah's arm ached from holding the umbrella, and her feet were blocks of ice in her wet sneakers. The milk jug felt like it weighed 100 pounds. A teenage boy on a bike sped past them, spraying water. Hey, what are you doing with that old lady? Sarah hunched her shoulders, pulling Mrs. Peterson closer. The woman didn't seem to notice the boy's tone. Eleanor always rode her bike too fast, she murmured. I told her to be careful. The cars don't always see you in the rain. They turned another corner. The houses here were bigger, with manicured lawns and expensive cars and driveways. Sarah felt increasingly out of place. A woman walking her dog gave them a suspicious look. Are you two all right? She called out, phone in hand. We're fine, Sarah said quickly. Just walking home? Eleanor, Mrs. Peterson stage whispered. Why is that woman staring at us? It's rude to stare. The woman frowned, typing something on her phone. Sarah quickened their pace, her wet shoes squishing with every step. Mrs. Peterson, she tried again. Maybe we should find somewhere dry to stop. Call someone to help us? But the elderly woman was lost in another memory. Remember the summer we had the big block party? Your father grilled hamburgers, and Mrs. Thompson brought her famous potato salad. Sarah's phone buzzed again. A text from her mother. Where are you? Lily says you're helping someone? Call me now. She started to type a response one-handed, but Mrs. Peterson suddenly stopped walking. Her face had gone pale. Eleanor, she whispered, I don't feel well. Everything's spinning. Sarah barely managed to catch her as the elderly woman's knees buckled. The milk jug crashed to the sidewalk, splitting open. White liquid mixed with rainwater, swirling down the gutter. Mrs. Peterson, are you okay? The woman blinked rapidly, steadying herself against Sarah. I don't know you. Where am I? Where's Henry? Sarah's heart pounded. The woman who'd been watching them was walking closer, phone to her ear. In the distance, thunder rolled again. It's all right, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. I'm Sarah. Remember? I'm helping you get home. Home? Mrs. Peterson's voice trembled. I want to go home. Please, I just want to go home. Rain dripped from the old woman's white hair, running down her face like tears. Sarah held her tighter, feeling her shiver. We'll find it, she promised. Just hold on to me. We'll find your home. Above them, streetlights began clicking on one by one as evening settled in. The spilled milk disappeared into the storm drain, carried away by the endless rain. Hey, what's going on here? A man's voice cut through the rain. Sarah turned to see a middle-aged white man in a rain jacket striding toward them. His face was tight with suspicion. Step away from Mrs. Peterson, he demanded, pulling out his phone. Right now. Sarah's throat closed up. Mrs. Peterson swayed against her, still disoriented. I'm just helping her get home, Sarah said, her voice coming out smaller than she wanted. She was lost in the rain. You're right. The man was already dialing. I've seen you walking around for the past hour. What are you really up to? Mrs. Peterson stirred, blinking at the man. George, is that you? No, Martha, it's Steve from number 42. Don't worry, I'm calling the police. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. Please don't. I swear I'm just trying to help her. Eleanor? Mrs. Peterson interrupted, grabbing Sarah's arm again. Why is everyone yelling? My head hurts. See? Sarah pleaded with the man. She's confused. She thinks I'm her granddaughter. I couldn't just leave her in the rain. Steve lowered his phone slightly, uncertainty crossing his face. How do I know you're telling the truth? Check her bag, Sarah said quickly. There must be something in there with her address. Right, Mrs. Peterson? The elderly woman clutched her plastic shopping bag closer. My bag? No, I need to get groceries for Henry. He likes his soup for dinner. Martha, Steve said firmly, let me see your bag. We need to get you home. Mrs. Peterson shrank away from him, pressing against Sarah. Eleanor, I don't like this man. He's not George. Where's George? Sarah kept her voice gentle. Mrs. Peterson, can I look in your bag? Just to help us find your house. The old woman hesitated, then slowly held out the bag. Sarah carefully looked inside while keeping the umbrella over them both. There was no wallet, no identification, just 3 cans of cat food and an old TV guide. See? Steve's finger hovered over his phone. This is suspicious. I'm calling it in. Wait. Sarah's voice cracked. Please, just help me get her home instead. You must know where she lives if you're a neighbor. Steve ran a hand through his wet hair. I've seen her around the neighborhood, but I don't know exactly which house. Martha, where do you live? But Mrs. Peterson was staring at a point in the distance, humming softly to herself. Sarah's phone buzzed again in her pocket. Probably her mom or Lily. The sky was getting darker. Look, she said, desperation creeping in her voice. You can follow us if you want. Just please don't call the police. They might. She couldn't finish the sentence, but the memory of what happened to her cousin Marcus after a neighbor called the cops on him for looking suspicious made her stomach clench. Steve studied her face for a long moment. Rain dripped from his jacket. Fine, he finally said, lowering his phone. But I'm walking with you. And if anything seems off, a car door slammed nearby, making them all jump. A woman's voice called out, Martha? Martha Peterson, is that you? They turned to see an older woman hurrying toward them, holding an umbrella. Mrs. Peterson brightened. Helen, is it time for Bridge Club? The newcomer reached them, out of breath. Martha, honey, what are you doing out here? We've been looking everywhere. You know her? Steve asked sharply. I'm Helen Roberts from her church group. She touched Mrs. Peterson's arm gently. Her daughter-in-law called me an hour ago, frantic. Martha wandered off while she was getting groceries from the car. Sarah felt a wave of relief so strong her knees went weak. The grocery store, Mrs. Peterson said suddenly. I need cat food for Mittens. Helen's face softened. Honey, Mittens passed away 3 years ago, remember? Mrs. Peterson's face crumpled. But I just bought. She looked down at her shopping bag in confusion. It's okay, Helen soothed. Then she turned to Sarah. Have you been helping her this whole time? Sarah nodded, shivering in her wet raincoat. I found her near the Methodist church. She was scared and confused. And you've been trying to get her home in this weather? Helen's eyes filled with tears. Bless your heart, child. Steve shifted uncomfortably. I was just making sure everything was okay. Of course you were, Helen said, but her tone was cool. She turned back to Sarah. What's your name, sweetheart? Sarah Johnson, ma'am. Well, Sarah Johnson, you're an angel. Martha's house is actually just 2 blocks from here. Would you help me get her there? Her family will want to thank you properly. Before Sarah could answer, Mrs. Peterson grabbed her arm again, hard. No, the elderly woman cried. Eleanor, don't leave. Don't get in that car again. Martha, honey, this isn't Eleanor, Helen said gently. Remember? Eleanor's gone. Mrs. Peterson's face went blank for a moment. Then she looked at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. Oh, who are you? What's happening? Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. I'm Sarah, Mrs. Peterson. I've been helping you walk home. Home? The elderly woman looked around wildly. But this isn't my street. Nothing looks right. Where's Henry? I want Henry. Her voice rose to a near scream. Several porch lights flicked on in nearby houses. Shoo, it's okay, Helen soothed, but Mrs. Peterson was becoming more agitated. No, you're all strangers. Eleanor, help me. She tried to pull away from them, stumbling on the wet sidewalk. Sarah barely caught her before she fell. Maybe we should call an ambulance, Steve suggested, reaching for his phone again. No, Helen said firmly. That will only upset her more. Her house is close. If we can just get her there. Sarah felt Mrs. Peterson trembling violently against her. The old woman's skin was cold and clammy. Mrs. Peterson, she said softly, remember the wind chimes? The silver ones that sound like church bells? We're going to find them. They'll lead us home. Something flickered in the elderly woman's eyes. Wind chimes? Yes, the ones Henry hung for your anniversary. We're almost there. Mrs. Peterson's grip on her arm loosened slightly. Henry always loved wind chimes. Said they were like music from heaven. Helen gave Sarah a grateful look. That's right, Martha. Let's go find those wind chimes. They started walking again, Sarah and Helen supporting Mrs. Peterson between them. Steve followed a few steps behind, phone still in hand. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now. Sarah's feet were numb, her clothes soaked through despite the raincoat. She'd lost track of how many calls she'd missed from her family. But as they turned another corner, a faint tinkling sound carried through the rain. Mrs. Peterson lifted her head. Do you hear that, Eleanor? Sarah smiled through her exhaustion. I do, Mrs. Peterson. We're almost home. The wind chimes sang in the darkness, leading them forward through the storm. The wind chimes grew louder with each step. Sarah's arm ached from supporting Mrs. Peterson, but she didn't dare let go. The elderly woman had gone quiet, shuffling between Sarah and Helen. Steve's footsteps splashed behind them, a constant reminder of his watchful presence. Sarah's phone vibrated again in her pocket. She couldn't check it. Not now. Just a little further, Helen encouraged, adjusting her grip on Mrs. Peterson's arm. Martha, honey, we're almost there. The old woman didn't respond. Her white hair hung in wet strings around her face. Sarah's mind drifted to another rainy night 3 years ago. She'd waited by the window for hours, watching headlights sweep past, hoping each car was her father's. Her mother had finally carried her to bed at midnight. He's not coming back, baby, she'd whispered, her voice rough with tears. Sometimes people just leave. A car horn jolted Sarah back to the present. Mrs. Peterson stumbled, nearly pulling them all down. Careful. Helen steadied them. Martha, do you need to rest? But Mrs. Peterson's eyes had gone wide with fear. The car. Eleanor was in the car. Shoo, Sarah soothed quickly. It's okay. Listen to the wind chimes. The silvery sound carried through the rain, clearer now. But Mrs. Peterson began to shake. No, you don't understand. She tried to pull away from them. Eleanor, the car didn't stop. It didn't stop. Martha. Helen's voice was sharp with worry. You're having one of your episodes. We need to get you home. Home? Mrs. Peterson's voice cracked. But Eleanor never came home. Why didn't she come home? Sarah felt the old woman's legs giving out. She braced herself, taking more of Mrs. Peterson's weight. Steve, Helen called over her shoulder. Run ahead to number 47. Tell them we found her. Steve hesitated. I don't want to leave you alone with. For heaven's sake, man. Look at this child. She's been helping Martha for hours. Go. He finally turned and jogged ahead into the rain. Sarah watched him disappear into the darkness, relief mixing with lingering anxiety. Eleanor, Mrs. Peterson whispered, clutching Sarah's raincoat. I'm so tired, dear. So tired of waiting. Sarah swallowed hard. I know, but we're almost there. Just hold on a little longer. The wind picked up, carrying the chimes, music in wild bursts. Sarah's wet braids whipped against her face. Her shoulders burned from holding up the umbrella and supporting Mrs. Peterson. Helen touched her arm gently. You must be exhausted, sweetheart. How long have you been out here? Sarah tried to check her watch, but the face was fogged over. I don't know. I was supposed to be home hours ago. Your family must be worried sick. My sister. Sarah's voice caught. She's alone. I need to call her. Soon, Helen promised. Let's get Martha home first. Then we'll sort everything out. They turned onto a tree-lined street. Through the rain, Sarah could make out a row of large houses set back from the road. Wind chimes tinkled from several porches. Mrs. Peterson lifted her head. Music, she murmured. Henry's music. That's right, Sarah said. We're getting closer. A police car crawled past them, spotlights sweeping the sidewalk. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat, but Helen waved at the officer. It's okay, she called out. We found her. Tell the others to call off the search. The car's radio crackled with voices. It made a U-turn and drove away, red taillights disappearing into the rain. They've been looking for 2 hours, Helen explained. Ever since Martha's daughter-in-law realized she was gone. Sarah's stomach twisted with guilt. If I'd known how to find her house sooner. Don't you dare blame yourself. You're the only one who stopped to help her at all. Mrs. Peterson's steps were getting slower, more unsteady. Her skin felt cold where it pressed against Sarah's arm. Eleanor, she whispered. I see the lights. Like that night. No, Mrs. Peterson. Different lights. Good lights. Home lights. But the elderly woman was lost in her memories again. The car was so bright. I told you to be careful in the rain. Why weren't you careful? Tears mixed with rain on Sarah's face. She thought of her own grandmother, the one she'd never met. Would someone have helped her if she'd been lost and confused? A group of teenage boys huddled under a nearby tree, watching them pass. Yo, what's with the granny patrol? Man, that little girl's been dragging that old lady around forever. Somebody should call the cops. Mind your own business. Helen snapped at them. Unless you want to help? The boys shuffled away, muttering. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the sidewalk ahead. Her phone buzzed again. Without letting go of Mrs. Peterson, she managed to pull it out. 15 missed calls. 23 text messages. Her mother's last text made her heart stop. If you don't answer in 5 minutes, I'm calling the police. Helen, Sarah's voice shook. I have to call my mom. Right now. Of course, honey. Here. Helen shifted to take more of Mrs. Peterson's weight. Make it quick. Sarah's cold fingers could barely work the phone. She hit redial, praying her mother would answer. Sarah Johnson. Her mother's voice exploded through the speaker. Where on God's green earth are you? Mom, I'm okay. I'm helping a lost elderly lady get home. She has Alzheimer's. You've been gone for hours. Lily's crying. I left work early. Do you have any idea? I know, Mom. I'm sorry. But I couldn't just leave her in the rain. Please, I'm almost done. We found her house. There was a long pause. Sarah could hear her mother breathing hard. Are you safe? She finally asked, voice tight with worry. Yes. I'm with her neighbor and a lady from her church. We're taking her home. Another pause. Text me the exact address. I'm coming to get you. Okay, Mom. I love you. Girl, you are so grounded. But her mother's voice had softened slightly. Love you too. Be careful. Sarah ended the call, just as Mrs. Peterson stumbled again. This time, they couldn't keep her upright. Henry, she cried out as her knees buckled. Henry, I can't find Eleanor. Sarah and Helen gently lowered her to sit on someone's front steps. The elderly woman was shaking violently now, her pink housecoat soaked through. Rest for a minute, Helen soothed, but her face was worried. Sarah, honey, there's a blanket in my car. It's the blue Honda, just up the block. Could you? No. Mrs. Peterson grabbed Sarah's hand. Don't leave, Eleanor. Don't get in the car. I won't leave you, Sarah promised. I'm staying right here. Helen looked torn. She needs to get warm. Look, Sarah pointed ahead through the rain. Is that Steve? A figure was running back toward them, splashing through puddles. We found her house. Steve called out. They're all waiting. Mrs. Peterson stirred at his voice. Waiting? Who's waiting for me? Your family, Martha, Helen said gently. They've been so worried. Can you stand? It's not far now. The old woman looked up at Sarah, her eyes suddenly clear. You're not Eleanor. Sarah's heart clenched. No, ma'am. I'm Sarah. I've been helping you get home. Home? Mrs. Peterson blinked rapidly. Yes. Yes, I need to go home. Henny will be worried. They helped her to her feet. She swayed but stayed upright between them. The wind chimes sang louder now, multiple sets creating a symphony in the storm. Sarah could see porch lights ahead, people moving behind bright windows. Almost there, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring Mrs. Peterson or herself. We're almost home. Something metal glinted at Mrs. Peterson's wrist, catching Sarah's eye. She squinted through the rain, still supporting the elderly woman's weight. "Mrs. Peterson," she said carefully, "what's that on your wrist?" Helen leaned in for a closer look. "Martha, is it your medical alert bracelet?" The old woman touched the silver chain absently. "Henry gave me this. For our anniversary." Sarah gently turned Mrs. Peterson's wrist. Through streaks of rain, she could make out engraved text. "Martha Peterson, 1247, Maple Street, Alzheimer's. If lost, call 503-555-0177 Helen." Sarah's voice cracked with excitement. "Look, her address was here the whole time." Helen read the bracelet, then closed her eyes briefly. "Lord help us. We could have called hours ago." Sarah pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. The screen was wet, but still worked. "Should I?" "No point now," Helen sighed. "We're only a block away. See those blue shutters up ahead? That's Martha's house." Mrs. Peterson was staring at her bracelet. Henry said I should never take it off, but I don't remember why." The wind picked up, driving the rain sideways. Sarah's umbrella turned inside out with a crack. She struggled to fix it while keeping Mrs. Peterson steady. "Just leave it, honey," Helen said. "We're almost there." Sarah let the broken umbrella fall. Rain pelted them directly now, but she barely noticed. Her clothes couldn't get any wetter. The incident with her teacher last week flashed through her mind. Mrs. Roberts ignoring her raised hand for the entire math class, calling on everyone else. Sarah had known the answers. She always knew the answers. But something in Mrs. Roberts' eyes said it didn't matter. "I don't belong here," Sarah had whispered to herself, staring at her untouched notebook. Now, supporting a confused elderly woman through the rain, that same feeling crept back. This wasn't her neighborhood. These weren't her people. Maybe she should have just kept walking. Mrs. Peterson stumbled, snapping Sarah back to the present. "Eleanor," the old woman mumbled, "why is everything spinning?" "Stay with us, Martha," Helen urged. "Look, there's your oak tree. Remember the oak tree?" A massive tree loomed ahead, its branches thrashing in the wind. As they got closer, Sarah could see silver wind chimes hanging from nearly every branch, singing wildly in the storm. "Henry's music," Mrs. Peterson whispered. "But it's so loud tonight." Movement caught Sarah's eye. A man was standing on a nearby porch, talking on his phone. When he spotted them, his face hardened. "Hey," he shouted over the wind. "What's going on? What are you doing with her?" "We're helping her get home," Helen called back. "She's confused." The man hurried down his steps, phone still raised. "I've got my finger on 911. Back away from her now." Sarah's legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. "Not again. Please, not again." But Mrs. Peterson chose that moment to speak, her voice suddenly strong. "Michael Thompson, you put that phone down this instant. Can't you see these nice people are helping me?" The man, Michael, froze. "Mrs. Peterson? You know them?" "Of course I." She trailed off, confusion crossing her face again. "Eleanor knows them. Don't you, Eleanor?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Sir, please. Check her medical alert bracelet. We're taking her to 1247 Maple. It's right there on her wrist." Michael approached cautiously, shining his phone's flashlight on Mrs. Peterson's bracelet. His expression shifted. "Oh, Jesus," he muttered. "Martha, we've been looking everywhere for you. Your son's frantic." "My son?" Mrs. Peterson blinked rain from her eyes. "But David's at college." "Let's get her home," Helen cut in firmly. She's soaked through and exhausted. Michael nodded, lowering his phone. "I'll call ahead. Let them know you found her." He looked at Sarah. "Sorry for, you know?" Sarah just nodded, too tired to speak. Her own phone buzzed again. Probably her mother, getting closer. They started walking again, past perfectly maintained lawns and expensive cars. The wind chimes grew louder with each step. Mrs. Peterson began humming softly, an old tune Sarah didn't recognize. The sound mixed with the chimes, creating an eerie melody. "Eleanor loved this song," she murmured. "We played it at her. Her voice cracked. Sarah felt her start to shake again. "Tell me about the wind chimes, Mrs. Peterson," she said quickly. "The ones Henry hung for you." The old woman's face softened slightly. "He bought them in Maine?" on our 40th anniversary trip. Said they reminded him of our wedding bells. She paused, frowning. Or was it our 30th anniversary? That's right, the wind chimes, Sarah encouraged. Listen how beautiful they sound. But Mrs. Peterson's brief clarity was fading. She stumbled again, nearly pulling them all down. I'm so tired, she whispered. Eleanor, why am I so tired? Helen shot Sarah a worried look. Her house is just there, the blue one. See, all the lights on? Sarah squinted through the rain. A two-story house glowed ahead, every window blazing. Several cars were parked in the driveway. People moved behind curtains, pacing. Mrs. Peterson showed no recognition. Pretty lights, she mumbled. Like Christmas? They were maybe 50 feet from the house when Sarah's phone rang again. This time she had to answer. Mom? I'm on Maple Street. Her mother's voice was tight with worry. Where are you exactly? Almost to 1247. The blue house with the oak tree. Mom, I'm sorry. Baby, not now. Just stay where you are. I see the house. Headlights swept around the corner. Sarah recognized her mother's old Toyota. Mrs. Peterson flinched at the light. The car, she whimpered. Eleanor, the car. No, it's okay, Sarah soothed. That's just my mom. We're almost to your house. See the wind chimes? The car pulled up alongside them. Sarah's mother jumped out, leaving the engine running. Sarah Johnson. She rushed toward them, then stopped short at the sight of Mrs. Peterson. Oh, my Lord! Mom, this is Mrs. Peterson. And Helen. Sarah's voice gave out. She was suddenly so tired she could barely stand. Her mother's face softened. Helen? I'm Marie Johnson. I'm so sorry about all this. Don't apologize, Helen said firmly. Your daughter is an angel. She found Martha wandering in the rain, confused and lost. Been helping her for hours. Marie's eyes filled with tears. Baby, why didn't you call sooner? Before Sarah could answer, Mrs. Peterson spoke up. Eleanor? Her voice was small, confused. Eleanor, is that your mother? Tell her I'm sorry about the accident. So sorry. Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks. Mrs. Peterson, I'm not Eleanor. But we're going to get you home now. Your family's waiting. The old woman stared at the blazing house ahead. Wind chimes sang all around them, a chaotic symphony in the storm. Home, she whispered. Yes, Henry will be waiting. Henry always waits. They took the last few steps together, moving slowly through the rain toward the warm lights and the endless music of the chimes. The front walk to Mrs. Peterson's house seemed to stretch forever. Each step was harder than the last, the group moving slowly through curtains of rain. Almost there, Helen kept saying. Just a few more steps. Sarah's mother walked beside them now, hands hovering like she wanted to help, but wasn't sure how. Her car idled at the curb, headlights cutting through the darkness. Mrs. Peterson had gone quiet, feet dragging. Her weight grew heavier against Sarah's side. The giant oak tree loomed over them, wind chimes creating a frenzied concert in the storm. As they passed under its branches, something small and dark shot across their path. Mittens? Mrs. Peterson perked up. Is that you, Kitty? Sarah's heart sank. Helen had said the cat died years ago. Just a shadow, she said gently. Look, we're almost to your door. The house's front porch glowed like a beacon. Sarah could see people moving inside, shadows passing behind gauzy curtains. Suddenly, the front door flew open. A man in his 50s rushed out. Mom! Oh, thank God! Mrs. Peterson lifted her head at his voice. David? But you're at college. The man's face crumpled. No, Mom. It's Robert, your son. David was my father. He hurried down the steps, reaching for his mother. But Mrs. Peterson shrank away, pressing closer to Sarah. Eleanor, she whispered. Who is that man? Mrs. Peterson. Sarah's voice shook with exhaustion. That's your son, remember? Robert. He's been waiting for you. More people spilled onto the porch. A woman in her 40s, two teenagers, Steve from earlier. Their voices overlapped in a blur of relief and concern. Martha! Grandma! Get her inside quick! Someone called Dr. Mitchell. Mrs. Peterson began to tremble violently. Too many people, she whimpered. Eleanor, make them go away. Everyone back up, Helen commanded sharply. You're overwhelming her. Robert, just you for now. The others retreated, leaving Robert standing alone in the rain. His eyes were red-rimmed, hands twisted together. Mom, he said softly, let's get you inside. You must be freezing. Mrs. Peterson stared at him blankly. Then her face changed, terror flooding her features. No, she cried, trying to pull away from Sarah and Helen. You're not David. Where's my son? Where's David? Mom, please. I want my son. Eleanor, don't let them take me. Her panic gave her strength. She yanked free, stumbling backward. Sarah lunged to catch her before she fell. Mrs. Peterson, you're safe. Sarah wrapped her arms around the shaking woman. No one's going to hurt you. We're here to help. The elderly woman sobbed into Sarah's shoulder. I want to go home. Please, just take me home. You are home, Sarah whispered. Listen to the wind chimes. Henry's wind chimes, remember? Above them, the silver chimes sang in the wind. Mrs. Peterson grew still, listening. Henry, she murmured. Yes, Henry hung those. For our anniversary. That's right. Sarah kept her voice steady despite her exhaustion. And this is your house with the blue shutters. Your family's been so worried about you. Robert took a careful step closer. Mom, do you remember the day we hung those chimes? You supervised from the porch while Dad and I climbed the ladder. Something flickered in Mrs. Peterson's eyes. Robert? My Robert. Yes, Mom. It's me. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch his face. You look so much like your father. Tears spilled down Robert's cheeks. I know, Mom. Let's get you inside, okay? Get you warm and dry. Mrs. Peterson nodded slowly. But when Robert tried to take her arm, she clutched Sarah's raincoat. Eleanor comes too. Sarah met Robert's questioning gaze. I'm Sarah. Sir, I found your mother near the Methodist church. She was lost in the rain. Understanding and gratitude flooded his face. Then you'd better come in too, Sarah. Help us get her settled. Sarah glanced at her mother, who nodded. Go on, baby. I'll wait here. Together, they helped Mrs. Peterson up the porch steps. The woman on the porch, Robert's wife, Sarah guessed, held the door open. Martha, honey, we've been so worried. But Mrs. Peterson didn't seem to hear her. She was focused entirely on the warmth and light spilling from the doorway. As they crossed the threshold, Sarah's wet shoes squeaked against polished hardwood. The house smelled like cinnamon and furniture polish. Everything gleamed. The banister, the mirror in the hall, the glass-fronted cabinets. Mrs. Peterson stopped suddenly, staring at a large photo on the wall. It showed a young woman with long blonde hair, laughing at the camera. Eleanor, she whispered, reaching toward the picture. My sweet girl. Robert's wife made a small, pained sound. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes again. Let's get you changed into dry clothes, Helen said firmly. Sarah, honey, help me get her upstairs. They started toward the staircase, but Mrs. Peterson's legs finally gave out completely. I can't, she gasped. So tired. Robert scooped his mother up like she weighed nothing. I've got you, Mom. Sarah, could you? I'll help Helen get her settled, Sarah finished. Despite her own exhaustion, she couldn't leave. Not yet. They climbed the stairs slowly. Family photos lined the walls. Holidays, graduations, weddings. In each one, Mrs. Peterson looked a little more confused, a little more lost. The master bedroom was huge, with pale blue walls and heavy curtains. Robert laid his mother gently on a floral bedspread. Eleanor's room was blue too, Mrs. Peterson mumbled. But darker. Like the sky before rain, Helen was already pulling dry clothes from a dresser. Martha, let's get you out of these wet things. Sarah. Mrs. Peterson reached for her. Don't leave. I'm right here. Sarah took her cold hand. I won't leave until you're settled. It took all three of them to get Mrs. Peterson changed into warm pajamas. Her skin was like ice, her white hair plastered to her skull. Should we call an ambulance? Robert asked quietly. Helen felt Mrs. Peterson's forehead. She's cold, but not dangerously so. Let's get her warm first, see how she does. I'll stay with her tonight. The guest room's made up. Robert's wife called from the doorway. And I've got coffee and food downstairs for everyone. Sarah's stomach growled at the mention of food. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. They tucked Mrs. Peterson under thick blankets. Her eyes were already closing. "Eleanor," she murmured. "Such a good girl. Helping an old woman home." "Rest now," Sarah whispered. "You're safe." She waited until Mrs. Peterson's breathing deepened into sleep before trying to pull her hand away. But the elderly woman's fingers tightened. "Don't go," she breathed, half asleep. "Stay." Sarah looked helplessly at Helen. "I'll sit with her," Helen said softly. "You go on downstairs, get warm. Your mother's waiting." Finally, Mrs. Peterson's grip relaxed. Sarah stood on shaky legs, her wet clothes dripping onto the carpet. At the bedroom door, she looked back. Mrs. Peterson seemed smaller somehow, lost in the big bed. But her face was peaceful now. The wind chimes sang softly outside the window, a gentle lullaby in the rain. Sarah's legs shook as she made her way down the curved staircase. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, and her feet squished in her ruined sneakers with each step. Robert's wife met her at the bottom of the stairs, holding a large towel. "Here, sweetie. You must be freezing." She wrapped the towel around Sarah's shoulders. "I'm Linda, by the way. Robert's wife." The towel smelled like fabric softener, the expensive kind Sarah sometimes smelled on her classmates' clothes. She clutched it tighter, suddenly aware of the puddle forming around her feet. "I'm sorry about the floor." "Don't you dare apologize." Linda's voice cracked. "You saved my mother-in-law's life tonight." Heavy footsteps approached from the kitchen. Robert appeared, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "Hot chocolate," he said, offering one to Sarah. "Extra marshmallows." Sarah took the mug with trembling hands. The ceramic was almost too hot to hold, but she welcomed the burn. "Your mother's in the kitchen," Linda said softly. "She's been telling us about your sister. How you're usually the one taking care of her after school." Heat crept up Sarah's neck. "Lily, she must be so scared." "She's okay," Robert assured her. "Your mom called her from our phone. She's with your neighbor now." Sarah took a sip of hot chocolate, letting it warm her from the inside. Her phone had finally died, the screen black and lifeless in her pocket. The front door opened, letting in a gust of wind and rain. Steve stepped inside, shaking water from his jacket. "Police called off the search," he reported. "And Dr. Mitchell says he'll come by first thing tomorrow." He caught sight of Sarah and cleared his throat. "Listen, kid, about earlier." "It's okay," Sarah mumbled into her mug. "No, it's not." Steve ran a hand through his wet hair. "I assumed, well, I was wrong. Really wrong. I'm sorry." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The hot chocolate burned her tongue, but she kept drinking. Linda touched her shoulder gently. "Come sit in the kitchen. You need to eat something." The Petersons' kitchen was bigger than Sarah's entire apartment. Granite countertops gleamed under warm lighting. A plate of cookies sat on the island beside a tray of sandwiches. Sarah's mother sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around her own mug. Her work uniform was wrinkled, hair falling from its usual neat bun. "Baby," she breathed, standing up. "Come here." Sarah practically fell into her mother's arms. The towel slipped from her shoulders, but she didn't care. She pressed her face into her mother's familiar shoulder and finally let herself cry. "Shoo." Her mother stroked her wet hair. "You're okay. Everything's okay." "I couldn't just leave her," Sarah hiccuped. "She was so scared." "I know, baby. I know." Linda discreetly wiped her eyes with a dish towel. Robert stared out the window, watching the rain. "The way Mom looked at her," he said quietly. "She really thought Sarah was Eleanor." "Your sister?" Sarah's mother asked. Robert nodded. "Mom's daughter from her first marriage. She died in a car accident 6 years ago, right after Mom's diagnosis. The doctors said the trauma accelerated her condition." Sarah remembered Mrs. Peterson's terror at every passing car. The way she begged Eleanor not to leave. "She loved her very much," she whispered. "Yes." Robert's voice was rough. "And tonight, somehow, that love helped lead her home." Footsteps creaked on the stairs. Helen appeared in the doorway. "She's sleeping," she reported. "Peaceful for now." "Linda, do you have something dry this young lady could change into?" "She's shivering." Sarah started to protest, but Linda was already hurrying from the room. She returned moments later with a bundle of clothes. "My daughter Emma's about your size. The bathroom's down the hall." In the elegant bathroom, Sarah peeled off her wet clothes. Everything stuck to her skin, refusing to let go. Her yellow raincoat lay in a soggy heap on the tile floor. The dry clothes were soft against her skin, clean sweatpants, a warm hoodie. They smelled like that same expensive fabric softener. When she returned to the kitchen, Linda had made her a plate of food. Turkey sandwiches cut into triangles, cookies, apple slices arranged in a fan. "Eat," her mother commanded gently. "You must be starving." Sarah hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. She devoured 2 sandwiches while the adults talked quietly around her. "Wandered off while I was bringing in groceries," Linda was saying. "I only turned my back for a minute." "She's getting worse," Robert said heavily. "The doctors warned us this would happen." "Maybe it's time to think about a care facility," Steve suggested. "No." Robert's voice was firm. "She stays home, with us. We just need to be more careful. Better security system, alarms on the doors." A loud crack of thunder made them all jump. The wind chimes sang frantically outside. "Storm's getting worse," Helen observed. "I'd better go check on Martha." She'd barely reached the doorway when they heard it, a terrified scream from upstairs. "Eleanor! Eleanor!" Sarah was moving before she realized it, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Behind her, feet pounded on hardwood. She reached the master bedroom first. Mrs. Peterson was sitting up in bed, eyes wild, reaching for something only she could see. "The car!" she cried. "Eleanor, watch out for the car!" Sarah rushed to the bed, taking Mrs. Peterson's outstretched hands. "Mrs. Peterson, you're okay. You're home. You're safe." The elderly woman clutched at her. "Eleanor, you're here. I had such a terrible dream." "Mom," Robert's voice cracked. "Mom, it's Robert. Your son." Mrs. Peterson blinked at him. Confusion clouded her face. "Robert? But you're just a boy." "No, Mom. I'm grown now. Remember? You're home. In your house. Home." She looked around the room like she'd never seen it before. Then her eyes found Sarah again. "Eleanor." Sarah squeezed her hands gently. "I'm Sarah, Mrs. Peterson. Remember? I helped you get home tonight." For a long moment, Mrs. Peterson stared at her. Thunder rolled outside. The wind chimes sang. Slowly, clarity crept back into her eyes. "Sarah," she whispered. "Yes." Sarah in the yellow coat. You found me in the rain?" "That's right." Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I found you, and we walked home together." Mrs. Peterson reached up to touch Sarah's face. Her hand was warmer now. "You're not Eleanor," she said softly. "But you have her heart." Behind them, Linda made a choke sound. Helen murmured something that might have been a prayer. "I'm sorry I scared you," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Everything gets so mixed up in my head these days." "Don't apologize," Sarah said fiercely. "I'm just glad you're home safe." Mrs. Peterson smiled, a real smile, full of clarity and warmth. "Thank you, Sarah, for not leaving me alone in the rain." The moment stretched, delicate as a soap bubble. Then thunder cracked again, and Mrs. Peterson jumped. "Mom," Robert stepped forward. "Why don't you try to sleep? Helen's going to stay with you tonight." "Sleep?" Mrs. Peterson's eyes were already growing distant again. "Yes, I should sleep. Eleanor always said I worried too much." She lay back against the pillows, still holding Sarah's hand. "Will you come visit me?" she asked softly. "Even though you're not Eleanor?" Sarah wiped her eyes with her free hand. "Yes, Mrs. Peterson. I'll visit you." "Good." Her eyes drifted closed. The wind chimes, they sound like bells. Within moments, her breathing deepened into sleep. But this time when Sarah tried to pull away, Mrs. Peterson let her go. Helen took her place in the bedside chair. "Go on, honey. Your mother's waiting." Sarah stood on shaky legs. The burst of adrenaline was fading, leaving her utterly drained. At the bedroom door, she looked back one last time. Mrs. Peterson slept peacefully, one hand curled on the pillow beside her face. Outside the window, the wind chimes sang their endless lullaby. Robert touched her shoulder gently. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you home." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Puddles from the storm glittered on the sidewalks. Sarah stared out the apartment window, still wearing Emma Peterson's borrowed clothes. Her mother hadn't said much on the drive home last night, just held Sarah's hand tight over the center console, like she was afraid her daughter might disappear. Now, getting ready for school felt surreal. Sarah's yellow raincoat hung dripping in the bathroom, her ruined sneakers stuffed with newspaper. "You don't have to go today," her mother said from the doorway. "I can call you in sick." Sarah shook her head. "I have a math test." Her mother crossed the room and pulled her into a tight hug. "You scared me half to death," she whispered. "But you did a good thing, baby. A brave thing." Sarah buried her face in her mother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar mix of coffee and drugstore perfume. "I just did what you do," she mumbled. Her mother laughed wetly. "Yeah, well, you're definitely grounded. But I'm proud of you." The walk to school felt different. People on their porches waved to her. Mr. Chen actually smiled when she stopped for milk. "No charge today," he said, pushing her money back. "I heard what you did for that lost woman. Very brave." Sarah clutched the milk bottle, warmth spreading in her chest. At school, Lily wouldn't leave her side. Her little sister followed her right to her classroom door. "You're really okay?" Lily asked for the 100th time. "Really okay?" Sarah hugged her. "Go on, you'll be late." She slipped in her seat just as the bell rang. Mrs. Roberts was writing math problems on the board. "Today's test will cover everything we've learned about fractions," the teacher announced. "Please clear your desks except for a pencil." Sarah pulled out her pencil, heart pounding. She hadn't studied, hadn't even thought about studying. Mrs. Roberts moved down the rows, distributing test papers. She paused at Sarah's desk. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I heard about what happened yesterday. If you'd like to take the test another day." Sarah looked up, meeting her teacher's eyes. Something had changed there, the usual dismissal replaced by something softer. "I can do it today," she said firmly. Mrs. Roberts nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe you can." The morning passed in a blur. Between classes, Sarah heard whispers. "That's her. Help some old lady for hours." In that crazy storm, she kept her eyes down, focused on getting through the day. But in the cafeteria, a hand touched her shoulder. "Sarah?" She turned to find Emma Peterson, the girl whose clothes she was wearing. Emma was a year ahead of her, one of the popular kids who never gave Sarah a second glance. "Mom told me what you did," Emma said. "For my grandmother. That was really amazing." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I have your clothes. I can bring them back tomorrow." "Keep them?" Emma smiled, a real smile, not the dismissive one she usually wore. "Hey, do you want to sit with us?" She gestured to her lunch table, where the other popular girls waited. Sarah glanced at her usual spot in the corner. "Thanks, but my sister's waiting." Emma looked disappointed but nodded. "Okay, but maybe another time?" "Maybe." Sarah carried her lunch tray to where Lily sat alone. Her sister's eyes were huge. "Was that Emma Peterson talking to you?" "Yeah." Sarah unwrapped her sandwich. "It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal, and they both knew it. After school, a sleek black car idled at the curb. Robert Peterson stepped out, Linda in the passenger seat. "Sarah." Linda hurried to hug her. "We hope we catch you. Mom's been asking for you all morning." Sarah clutched her backpack straps. "Is she okay?" "She's having a good day," Robert said. "Very clear. She remembers everything about last night, and she'd really like to thank you properly." Sarah glanced at Lily, who was practically vibrating with curiosity. "Can my sister come too?" "Of course." Linda smiled warmly. "We'll call your mother from the house. Let her know where you are." The drive to the Petersons took only minutes in the car. In daylight, the neighborhood looked even fancier. Perfectly manicured lawns, expensive cars in every driveway. Lily pressed her face to the window. "This is where you were last night?" Sarah nodded, remembering how long that walk had felt in the rain. The giant oak tree stood peaceful now, wind chimes barely moving in the gentle breeze. They tinkled softly as Sarah and Lily followed the Petersons up the front walk. Inside, the house smelled like fresh cookies. Helen sat in an armchair near the fireplace, knitting, and there was Mrs. Peterson, wearing a neat cardigan, her white hair styled. She looked up as they entered. For a moment, Sarah held her breath. "Sarah." Mrs. Peterson's face lit up. "And this must be your sister. Lily, isn't it?" Sarah's knees went weak with relief. She hadn't expected Mrs. Peterson to remember her name, let alone Lily's. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Peterson?" "Much better, thanks to you." The elderly woman patted the couch beside her. "Come sit. Tell me about your day." They spent the next hour talking. Mrs. Peterson was lucid and engaged, asking questions about school, about their mother, about their lives. Lily was shy at first, but soon opened up, especially when Linda brought out a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies. "Your sister is very special," Mrs. Peterson told Lily. "She has a gift for helping others." Lily beamed. "I know. She helps me with everything." Sarah felt her face grow hot, but Mrs. Peterson just smiled. "That doesn't surprise me at all." She reached for Sarah's hand. "Some people see someone in trouble and look away. But you stopped. You helped a confused old woman find her way home." "Anyone would have," Sarah mumbled. "No," Robert said firmly. "They wouldn't. We know because they didn't. You were the only one who stopped." Mrs. Peterson squeezed her hand. "And because you did, I got to meet this wonderful young lady who reminds me so much of my Eleanor. Not in looks, perhaps, but in here." She touched her heart. Sarah felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back. "Mom," Linda said gently, "why don't you tell Sarah about the scholarship?" Sarah looked up. "Scholarship?" Robert cleared his throat. "We serve on the board of the Portland Community Foundation. They offer educational scholarships to deserving students. We'd like to nominate you." Sarah's mouth went dry. "But I'm only in 6th grade. It's for when you're ready for college," Linda explained. "A full ride to any school in Oregon. We've already spoken to your principal, and she's enthusiastically supporting the nomination." I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Mrs. Peterson said simply. "Eleanor always said education was the key to changing lives. Let us help change yours." Lily grabbed Sarah's arm. "Sarah, you could go to college." Their mother had always said they'd find a way to afford college. But Sarah had seen the worry in her eyes when she looked at bills, had heard her crying late at night over the kitchen table. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve." "You do," Mrs. Peterson cut her off. "You deserve every good thing, Sarah Johnson. Never doubt that." A knock at the door interrupted them. Helen set down her knitting to answer it. Steve stood on the porch, holding Sarah's broken umbrella. "Found this down the street," he said gruffly. "Thought you might want it back." Sarah started to say the umbrella was ruined, not worth saving. But Mrs. Peterson spoke first. "Steve, come in, come in. Sarah's visiting. And this is her sister, Lily." To Sarah's surprise, Steve entered and sat down. Even more surprising, he had questions about school, about what subject she liked best. "Math," she admitted, "and science. I want to be a doctor someday." "A doctor!" Mrs. Peterson clapped her hands. "Oh, you'll be wonderful at that." Such a caring heart. More neighbors dropped by as the afternoon went on. Each one had a kind word, a smile, a question about Sarah's dreams. The same people who had looked at her with suspicion last night now looked at her with respect. Even admiration. It shouldn't have mattered. Shouldn't have made her sit taller, speak more confidently. But it did. As the sun began to set, Robert insisted on driving them home. "We'll pick you up again on Saturday," Linda said, hugging them goodbye. "Mom would love to have you for lunch." Mrs. Peterson hugged them last, holding Sarah extra tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being my Eleanor when I needed one." In the car, Lily chattered excitedly about the house, the cookies, the scholarship. Sarah watched the neighborhood pass by outside her window. The oak tree's wind chimes caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming like captured stars. Their gentle music followed the car down the street. "Sarah?" Lily's voice turned serious. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Sarah turned from the window, throat tight with tears. "No," she said softly. "Be like yourself. That's even better." But as they drove home through the gathering dusk, Sarah felt something new unfurling in her chest. Something that felt a lot like pride. 1 month later, Sarah walked down Morrison Street wearing a new yellow raincoat. The old one had never quite recovered from that stormy night, but Mrs. Peterson had insisted on replacing it. "Yellow suits you," she'd said. "Like sunshine in the rain." The morning was crisp and clear, fall settling into Portland like a comfortable blanket. Sarah adjusted her backpack, now containing not just school books, but the thick scholarship application Linda had helped her fill out. Mr. Chin waved from his store window as she passed. Inside, she could see him helping Mrs. Wilson find her reading glasses. The same Mrs. Wilson who'd ignored Sarah that rainy evening. Now she called out through the open door, "Sarah, honey, Are you visiting Martha today? After school, Sarah replied, We're having tea. These afternoon visits had become a routine. 3 times a week, Sarah and sometimes Lily would spend a few hours at the Peterson house. Some days, Mrs. Peterson was clear and present, full of stories about Eleanor and Henry. Other days, she drifted, confused but always calmed by Sarah's presence. The school appeared ahead, its brick walls bright in the morning sun. Sarah climbed the steps, remembering how different things had been just a month ago. Mrs. Roberts looked up from her desk as Sarah entered the classroom. Good morning, Sarah. Ready for the presentation today? Sarah nodded, touching the folder in her backpack. Inside was her speech about community service, which she'd been asked to give at the school assembly. A little nervous, she admitted. Mrs. Roberts smiled, a real smile, the kind she gave all her students now. You'll do wonderfully. Just speak from the heart, like you always do. Sarah slipped into her seat, no longer at the back, but right in the middle of the classroom. Emma Peterson waved from across the aisle. Come to lunch today? Emma asked. We're planning the winter formal committee. Can't. Studying with Lily. Sarah had been invited to join various clubs and committees since that night, but she never let them interfere with her sister's needs. Emma nodded, understanding. Tomorrow, then. We really want your ideas. The morning passed quickly. In history, they discussed civil rights leaders who'd changed their communities through small acts of courage. Sarah felt her classmates' eyes on her, but kept her own fixed on her notebook. At lunch, she and Lily sat at their usual table, no longer alone. Other students had gradually migrated to join them, kids who'd never had a set group, who knew what it felt like to be outsiders. Tell us about Mrs. Peterson, a quiet boy named Marcus asked. Is she really getting better? Sarah spread peanut butter on her sandwich, thinking about her last visit. She has good days and bad days. Yesterday was good. She remembered everyone's names, even told stories about when Robert was little. And the scholarship? Lily prompted proudly. Tell them about that. Sarah felt her face warm. It's not final yet, but it was close. The Portland Community Foundation Board had fast-tracked her application. Linda said it was just a formality now. The scholarship would be hers. My mom says what you did was brave, a girl named Jenny said softly. Standing up to those people who thought you were doing something wrong. Sarah thought about Steve, who now brought vegetables from his garden to Mrs. Peterson every week. About Michael Thompson, who'd installed a better security system in the Peterson house, free of charge. People can surprise you, she said. Sometimes they just need a chance to be better. The afternoon assembly came too quickly. Sarah stood backstage, clutching her folder, heart pounding. Through the curtain, she could hear the principal introducing her. Showed us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Sarah's mother had taken off work early to be there. She sat in the front row beside Linda Peterson, both women beaming. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience a blur of faces. She opened her folder, then closed it again. The carefully written speech suddenly felt unnecessary. A month ago, she began, her voice shaking slightly, I met someone who was lost. Not just physically lost, but lost in her memories, in her fear, in her confusion. The story poured out of her, not the polished version she'd prepared, but the raw truth of that rainy night. The fear, the exhaustion, the moments of doubt. I kept thinking about my grandmother, she said, the one I never met. If she had been lost and scared, I'd want someone to help her. To see her as a person, not a problem. In the audience, her mother wiped tears away. Linda squeezed her hand. Mrs. Peterson taught me something important, Sarah continued. She showed me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust each other. Trust that under all our differences, all our fears and suspicions, we're connected. We're family. After the assembly, there was a small reception in the library. Sarah's mother hugged her tight. Your grandma May would be so proud, she whispered. So proud. Linda pressed a small box into Sarah's hands. From Martha. She wanted to be here, but it's not a good day. Inside the box was a single silver wind chime, smaller than the ones in the oak tree, but just as musical. A note in Robert's handwriting read, to remind you that music can lead us home. That afternoon, Sarah hurried through her homework so she could visit Mrs. Peterson. The walk to Maple Street was familiar now, each turn etched in her memory. The giant oak tree came into view, its wind chimes singing softly in the breeze. New security cameras tracked her approach, but the neighbors just waved. Helen opened the door before Sarah could knock. "She's been asking for you," she said quietly. "It's been a difficult day." Sarah found Mrs. Peterson in her favorite chair by the window. The elderly woman stared out at the oak tree, shoulders slumped. "Mrs. Peterson? It's Sarah." She turned slowly. "Eleanor? No, it's Sarah. Remember? I come visit you on Wednesdays." Confusion clouded Mrs. Peterson's face. "Sarah? Sarah in the yellow coat." "That's right." Sarah sat beside her, taking her cold hand. "Would you like to hear about my day?" Mrs. Peterson squeezed her fingers. "Yes, dear. Tell me everything." So Sarah told her about the assembly, about her classmates, about the wind chime gift. As she talked, clarity gradually returned to Mrs. Peterson's eyes. "You're doing so well," the elderly woman said softly. "Eleanor would be proud. Do you miss her very much?" "Every day. But having you here, it helps. You have her spirit, her kindness." Sarah thought about the scholarship application sitting in her backpack, about the future promised. "I want to be a doctor," she said. "Help people who are lost and scared, like you were." Mrs. Peterson touched her cheek gently. "You already do that, dear. Every single day." They sat together as afternoon faded into evening, listening to the wind chimes sing. Sarah's new yellow raincoat hung by the door, ready for whatever storms might come. And outside, under the oak trees' spreading branches, the silver chimes danced in the wind, a symphony of hope, of trust, of coming home. Not for Eleanor, who was gone. Not for Mrs. Peterson, who still wandered in her memories. But for Sarah Johnson, who had learned that sometimes the longest journey wasn't finding your way home. It was helping someone else find theirs.